Hey, glad to see that you came back for part two. I hope you enjoy. Take care. All right, so we're going to return to the last 7 peak principles, just so it's more convenient for folks who want to break this up into a couple of shorter videos. So we covered the first 7, and we're going to begin with number 8. And so, Faye, number 8 is that as peak, we conceive of 4 different types of estrangement, and I'm going to read them. There's leverage, there's hardwired, there's therapeutic, developmental, and situational. And maybe if we just speak a little bit more broadly about those, and then maybe we can provide the table. I think maybe put that in the description below too, so people could see this a little bit more succinctly. But if you would just talk about that, the 4 different types in general, that might be really helpful for people to know that everyone has a story that's different.
Yeah. So yeah, the thing that I've observed is that there are these different types, and while there's a common kind of experience of estrangement and the way that affects us, there are some differences, and so the first one, just very quickly, is leveraged, and that's where there is a third party. That could be the spouse of your adult child, or a boyfriend, girlfriend, friend, business partner. Or it could be their parent and an ex-spouse of yours that are kind of pressuring things and pushing things in the direction of estrangement. Mm-hmm. That leveraged.
Yeah.
Because there's this force being applied toward estrangement. Second one's hardwired. That's where there's an issue within the child, the parent, the relationship that isn't going to change easily. So it could be a difficult to treat mental illness. It could be a big difference in temperament that sometimes occurs. It's difficult to bridge. It could be a difference in values, or it could be something related to previous generations. As you're talking about family systems, Kelly, that's difficult to change too. I mean, that's really is something that kind of comes down through the family. We're generally not conscious of, that is having a big impact. So we call that hardwired. So there are those estrangements. Then there are what I call therapeutic developmental, and that's where there's something that's happening in the life of the adult child or the parent that's more easily dealt with. Depression or anxiety, and someone goes on medication, or they go to therapy. People just need some basic listening skills, and sometimes they can get through things that way. There can be an addiction. The person goes into addiction treatment and joins AA or whatever, and they come through that process. So, or it could be developmental. It could be a 20-year-old. And we know the brain is not completely developed until 25. For some of us, it's 55, 55. But there's the hope that with the maturing of that person, that some different choices could be made. So that's what we call therapeutic developmental. And then the final one is situational. And that's where an adult child is in a situation where they go off to college, or they go into the military, they have a job assignment overseas. Something happens that physically takes them out of the location, usually, and then they stop communicating. That's, again, more related to a temporary situation that likely is going to change. Mm-hmm. Those are the 4 different types, Kelly, and some of them, frankly, are more difficult to deal with than others.
Yeah. Yeah, and in this day and age, for situational, we probably would have to consider COVID.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
You've said some things about COVID too, as a kind of trial period.
Yeah, one of the things that we know is in the pattern of estrangement, it's not generally a one and done. There's things that lead up to it. And in that process, the adult child tests their ability to be distance, and then they come back and then they try it again in another way. Maybe it's just emotional at first and very subtle, and it continues to grow. And I think COVID provided an opportunity for some people to make that break with a quote unquote excuse. Oh, I can't come over, don't want to expose you. Then the contact decreased. And then a letter comes or a text or an email. And so COVID was sort of like the entree to, this is something I want to try, and this is the perfect opportunity to do it.
Yeah.
So that is part of this, one of the situational ones, as far as how it began. I might find later, after I've worked with somebody, that it's leveraged and I didn't realize it until we
Right.
talk a little bit more, but it could be also situational. So just something to think about with that. But the ninth, moving on, the ninth peak principle is that in peak, we envision healthy relationships between parents and adult children. And we want them to, in the best case scenario, our relationships with our children become adult. And so you have four principles within that, really four characteristics, I guess I should say, that you find are, I don't know, would you say that they are necessary, that they be there? You've got in your principle that it's characterized by these four
Right.
different situations. How would you describe that to someone who's interested in knowing what you mean by this adult to adult relationship?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, we come out of adolescence into adulthood. And I think our vision in peak is that as we come into adulthood, that adulthood will then translate into an adult to adult relationship with a parent, which doesn't always happen. And sometimes because the parent won't let it become adult to adult, they insist on always being, the parent. But sometimes it's the adult child doesn't make that transition, and so they insist on being an adolescent and taken care of. It needs to be intentional, but how do we do that? And where are the books on how to do that? There are literally thousands of books on parenting, but they're all about parenting children and teenagers and maybe young adults. But then where are the books on how we develop the relationship between parents and their adult children? And so anyway, I find these four characteristics. I would say that without them, I don't know if I'd say they're essential, but I'd say without them, something is really missing that affects the quality of that relationship. So they are mutuality. It simply means that both the parent and the adult child holds responsibility for the relationship. They call each other. They plan. They each plan things. They each correspond with each other. So they each play a role in that relationship. And then after mutuality is commitment. Commitment says, I'm with you and I'm not, I'm in this relationship and I'm committed to this relationship, and you don't have to walk on eggshells for fear that I'm going to walk out of the relationship. I mean, we're always going to go through difficulties, but we have some foundation that we are trust and are confident in. And that's the commitment to the relationship. The third is authenticity, and that is we're going to talk about meaningful things. We're not going to always just try to protect one another, and we're going to talk about stuff that really matters. And the fourth is my favorite. It's gratitude. If all you have is mutuality, that can become tit for tat. I send you a card, you send me a card. I buy you a gift, you buy me.
Yeah.
Gratitude makes it more than that. It's saying, one of my favorite phrases is, I miss you. I'm not the same without you. And so expressions of that in all the forms it can take. Cards, letters, just saying it. I appreciate who you are in my life. Gratitude. That is such an important, I think, quality rather than entitlement. You know, I'm entitled to have whatever you give me in your life. No, no, no. Gratitude is it's a gift. So those four things are kind of guiding lights for me in adult to adult relationships.
Yeah. And they're all really present in some of the best relationships I know.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I always try to shoot for in relationships that count. How do we build? And yeah, and if we can develop that, and it's probably a star in the sky with our parents and adult relationships. Maybe never quite get there, but boy, it's you can navigate with a star in the sky.
That's true.
Yeah.
So the 10th principle, and I'm going to read this one because I really love the way that it's in here, is Peak accepts the reality that as groups, parents and adult children are equally subject to the attributes and fallibilities that characterize human beings in general. Wow. Reality that we're all flawed individuals. That's really a pretty spiritual concept when you get right down to it. And you're the person to talk about spirituality. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, I could probably talk about being flawed as well as I could talk about spirituality. But yeah, I mean, this is just at the core of you know, most faith traditions, that we are human beings, that, you know, some would say we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and that human experience is always going to, you know, be flawed, and we all have gifts, and there are shadow sides to every gift. Yeah, again, in my particular tradition, if you look at the ministry of Jesus, it was so much of it was about reaching out to people who were rejected because of their failures in one way or another, and trying to encourage people to accept one another. So, and so when I, you know, when I read about parents talking about their the next generation, what's wrong, what's wrong with that generation? Well, the same things that were wrong with you.
Yes.
And then sometimes I hear adult children talking about, you know, their parents, that they don't do things very well, that they're not very good at communicating, that they don't listen. And this is where research comes in handy, because the research shows there basically is no difference in our ability to listen over the course of a lifetime, you know. So there is no difference between adult children in that generation and parents in terms of their ability to listen. And the research shows none of us are really very good at it.
It does.
So yeah, we're all flawed in the ways we complain about, you know, in one another. We all have maybe a different flavor, but we all have flaws. And I think recognizing that is critical to our ability to forgive, to offer grace, and to give relationships another chance. But it's difficult to do that if we don't recognize that at this root, we all have both these wonderful qualities as human beings and these amazing flaws as well.
Amazing flaws. So true. And so when we think about the equality that we have with our flaws and our fallibilities, but as well our attributes, the things that we bring to the table that people appreciate, it's helpful to recognize that, you know, generationally, it can feel very like you're so different than me. There's a generation gap. I remember talking about the generation gap.
Yeah.
But as we look back over time, there's always that generation gap. because we all think the same. We think the same as teenagers and early young adults as people who are older parents and grandparents. And we look at things much the same generationally. And so we're just carrying that forward. The old folks don't get it, and the young folks don't get it. It just depends on who you're talking to.
Well, yeah, and I mean, we're engaged in different tasks at different points in our lives, right? So we see through that lens, things look different to us. We live in a time of great change. I mean, I don't remember generations having names when I was a kid. Why do they have names now? Well, because the world is changing so quickly, and different generations adapt to that to a different degree. And so that affects our things, being in these different generational cohorts that have these qualities. But yeah, deeper than that, beneath all that are, again, our gifts and our flaws. And it's important, I think, for estranged parents to remember that just because your child doesn't have a relationship with them doesn't make all those wonderful qualities of them go away. And all those gifts they have go away. They're still got them, and they're using them in the world in whatever way they are supposed to do that. And the fact they don't have right now a relationship with you doesn't change that. So I remember that, and I appreciate that about my own children, and send them every blessing in the world for those gifts they have and bring into the lives of others.
Yes, that is true. The 11th peak principle really states what we've talked about in different ways a little bit earlier, and that is that in peak we believe that engaging in the recovery process, in the recovery process from the parental trauma that we experience from the estrangement and the relationship breach, that lays the groundwork for developing a co-created narrative. And that is I'm going to say essential to the healthy, sustainable reconciliation that we all hope for. That is something
I'm not going to even talk about that because that's yours, Kelly. Co-create.
So
you got to describe that.
So I'll describe co-created narrative, but then I'm going to ask you to share about it, because when you first heard the concept, it was so exciting to you. So the co-created narrative piece is when I tell my story and you tell your story, and they are on opposite ends of the pole. And it's like, how in the world did they get that from what I said? And believe me, the person on the other end is thinking the same thing. I've been in the room with these people before for many, many times. But the co-created narrative is what happens when we're able to listen deeply and recognize that, wow, I did not know that about you at the time, or I didn't hear it that way. And I'm able to come to a place that allows me to recognize that there was a dynamic there that I was not aware of. And it can actually at times move us to compassion and help us to understand why we are on opposite ends of the pole, and understanding how this even came to be. And so the work of coming to a co-created narrative is made easier for the parent once they've gone through the recovery process, or as they go through it, because they come to recognize that there are things that they weren't aware of, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe my kid heard it that way. And also the development of the compassion to be able to say, I believe them when they say they heard it that way. It's not what I intended, but I believe them. And so being able to come to that realization, and it doesn't, it really takes out the my fault, your fault piece. It's like, wow, this was our fault. We were really not communicating well, and making a lot of assumptions. But as as an estranged parent, when you heard this concept, you really were, I don't know, you were excited by it. Yeah, I can't, I don't want to say what you were. Do you want to share a little bit about what it meant to you as an estranged parent to learn this?
Well, it's so descriptive of the experience. I mean, I probably initially it was most helpful because it's like, well, I certainly know what not having a co-created narrative feels like. I mean, that's the experience of so many estranged parents because there's a set um, of facts that probably are not generally not in dispute from either the parent or the child, but there's a totally different story that's created around that set of facts and what happened, depending upon the motivations assigned largely. And uh, and so I hear this all the time from estranged parents that I do this, take this action with this expectation, but it is experienced as something totally different.
Yeah.
And so when it's like the universe is turned upside down, it's like you forgot. It's like you forgot to know how to tie your shoes. It's things that you've done all your life, things that you do and say, and you think it's going to have this effect. And it has a very opposite effect because there's a different story that is created around that. And so it creates from the parent side, a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of experience, because you can't get the stories to match. They just don't line up. So I think when you first talked about that, what I appreciated about it was this really nails what's going on. This is so descriptive of we have no co-created narrative. We have two storylines that are quite different, and you can't, and no fact is going to match them up. You got to be willing to listen to the other person and what they're saying and what they're feeling, and affirm and appreciate that. More facts. No, this is what happened. More facts isn't going to do it. So, and I think the additional part of what I appreciate about what you said is it requires both parties to listen. And I mean, I often hear, understandably, adult children say, my parents don't listen. That's why we have the estrangement. Parents don't listen. Probably is the case. None of us are good listeners. But there's also a need, if there's going to be a reconciliation, for the adult children to be able to listen and hear too. And that's why I think a therapist who can facilitate that kind of process, as you talk about it, Keli, is so important.
And I think it's hopeful also because so many parents have gone through the process with a therapist where they're told to listen and do not respond to everything their child has to say. And that is a good part of a co-created narrative, but it's not the end. And so many parents get frustrated with, when do I get to be heard? And so if we keep that tension in the relationship where the parent is feeling blamed, unable to tell their part of the narrative, that is not necessarily going to work. And at times I have seen that become abusive, and a therapist has to step in and say, wait a minute, that's not helping. This is not the way to have a conversation. So that's why the co-created narrative is really so important to the whole process, and preparing for it through the recovery process is really helpful.
No, absolutely. And we do have parents come into PEAK who've been through the half of it, right? They've listened, they've heard, but they're very frustrated because that's where it's ended. And of course, they're traumatized, right? So they're not in the best position to be listening at that point because the trauma often has not been dealt with. So yeah, kind of completing that process with a vision for all of it is just
Mhm.
important to kind of work at it from both sides.
And the trauma can be resurrected in those moments where the parent has to hear all of it again and not respond. At the very least, if the parent believes they're going to have that opportunity to share their part of the narrative, they can listen better. But
Yes, yes.
yeah, shutting down that listening is a real defense mechanism when it's painful. And so you might not even hear it then, even in this presence of a therapist.
And I think sometimes what estranged parents experience is um, that they're not allowed to have their thoughts and feelings and motivations. That um, I'm telling you what I think, and I'm telling you what I feel, and I'm telling you why I did what I did. But you're saying, no, that's not what you think, and that's not what you feel, and that's not why you did what you did. And so that assignment of thinking and feeling and motivation from both sides is a part of, without, instead of listening and appreciating that, is a part of what contributes to the lack of that narrative.
Mm.
Being willing to acknowledge the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of another, and to take them to take them at their word, is an important part of that process.
Yeah, it is. It is. So the 12th principle, the 12th key principle, talks about harm reduction model. And I want to mention that a little bit because abstinence in when I think about abstinence in the estrangement, I just think it's you're just refraining from everything and not having the opportunity to work with another person, your child. So the harm reduction model that we look at for reducing the symptoms, I think is a more appropriate model. And because it takes our human fallibility into consideration, we are going to have backslides. We're going to make mistakes and we can start over and we can pick up where we left off and start moving forward again to our best self, to getting to that place where we can really live with purpose and zest. What are your thoughts on the harm reduction model as it applies to recovery?
Uh, yeah, Kelly, of course, you introduced me to this model, and I think it is so appropriate and helpful. I mean, originally, when I was thinking about peak, I was thinking about a recovery from addiction model. And of course, you can go to an AA meeting and you can hear people say, I haven't had a drink for 20 years. Well, you're not gonna have an estranged parent that say, I haven't felt bad for 20 years. I mean, you're just not going to you're not going to get to a point in life where you don't have some effect of estrangement. So our goal is to reduce the harm, to give people an opportunity to get as much healing as they can, uh, a recovery of um, their kind of different aspects of life. I think we're going to talk about in a minute. And I think that's just much more realistic. And as you say, there are going to be harder days. There are going to be harder seasons. There's going to be the holidays. Always going to be harder. There's going to be Mother's Day and Father's Day. That's always going to be harder.
Yeah.
Doesn't need to cripple you. It's a little bit, and we've talked about this analogy, Kelly. It's a little bit like losing a limb. Um, it you can't grow an arm back after you've lost it, and you can't really say it doesn't have any impact on my life. But you can find ways, and we've been inspired by people who've lost limbs to do all kinds of things in life to leave a meaningful and purposeful life. So it's a little bit like that. It's a loss you never fully get over, but it's one that you learn to live with in ways that don't cripple you and keep you from a productive, meaningful, and zestful life. So I love the model. I think it's great.
So let's look at the 13th peak principle, and I'll just read it here. It says, peak suggests that a relationship with a spiritual source is a key aspect of recovery without adopting a particular theological perspective. Through the aid of this source, parents achieve spiritual sobriety as evidenced by a calm spirit, clear mind, and a loving heart. So I'm going to let you run with this one, Pastor.
Okay. Yeah, I think from a spiritual perspective, and that's what we encourage people to in Peak to adopt without a particular religious tradition. In that sense, we're like AA. Really sees that we are on a journey, and however it's articulated, that journey has a purpose, and that purpose includes work that we're supposed to do, people we're supposed to love, lessons we're supposed to learn, experiences we're supposed to have. And we believe those are grounded spiritually, that they really come from a spiritual source. We also believe our identity comes from a spiritual source. Our identity is not simply a biological identity, a DNA chemical identity, but that we have an identity that's grounded spiritually in the fact that we are all related to God in some way, children of God, children of the universe, however you want to express that, and that nothing can take that identity away. And then that we have a past with all of its gifts and flaws, but that it had meaning, that we can look back on it and realize that we were here for that purpose. That all is grounded spiritually. And so it's essential for estranged parents in their recovery process to reaffirm their identity, because they've spent so much time parenting that when the parenting kind of goes south, that relationship, they're like, what's my identity now? So helping people find that spiritual identity or find it for the first time. It's critical. To find their purpose in life. What are they called to do now? What's the work? Who are they called to love? What are those relationships supposed to look like now? What are the lessons that they're supposed to learn? And to recognize their children may have a different set of lessons, people to love, what to do, and it may take a different direction. And it's not about who's to blame at all. It's about you have a different kind of assignment in the world. And then we look upon our past and we look for someone that said, we live our lives looking forward, but we understand looking back. So we can look with spiritual eyes and kind of understand what we were about. All of that, I think, is really of critical importance to our recovery process. And understanding that if we're all children of God, in whatever way you express that, our children are really more our brothers and our sisters. They're more our siblings. And we're kind of on this journey kind of together, trying to find our way home. As far as spiritual sobriety goes, it's kind of interesting. I love the word sobriety. In the New Testament, the word doesn't mean free of intoxication. It means having a calm spirit, clear mind, loving heart. And as estranged parents, those are really hard to get to because you don't feel very calm. You feel pretty agitated. You feel pretty anxious. You may feel panicky. You don't feel calm at all. As an estranged parent, you don't have a clear mind. You're very confused, especially at the beginning. It's like you have no idea why this is happening. I forget the percentage, Kelly, you probably know it. It's a large percentage, I don't know if it's 60%, indicate they don't know why this has even happened. Yeah. So there's this mental confusion and racing of thoughts and thinking about what you said and they said, and if you ever had a chance to have another conversation, what you're going to say and what they might, your mind is just going round and round. And then having loving hearts. As a strange parent, you have a loving heart, but it's a broken heart.
Oh my, yeah.
Risky hearts, because they can risk scarring, they can risk hardening, they can risk withdrawing,
Yeah.
and risk doing all kinds of things that are being resentful, that are not good for us. So as a strange parent, you're subject to these things that are the very opposite of sobriety. So I talk about, you can fall off the wagon any day of the week. You can be doing pretty well, be pretty calm, have a pretty clear mind, be loving and open. And then all of a sudden something happens, and it's like taking your first drink again. You're back, feeling all of these other things. So what's it take to get there? In my experience, and I think the experience of many others, is to have that spiritual sobriety requires a spiritual source to whom you can go and find calm spirit by recognizing what you don't have control over, and letting it go. That's the serenity prayer, right? You can find through this spiritual source clarity of thought. You can find through this spiritual source the motivation, the energy, to continue to love, to not become hard, but to continue to love, including loving yourself, giving yourself, having compassion on yourself, and then having compassion on everyone else out there, including your kids, and finding the capacity out of that broken heart, to get better rather than bitter. And I think a spiritual source helps us do that.
Yeah. 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 And sharing that piece of it, you really sort of overlapped into the 14th principle. So we'll just continue into that. It says peak work. Plan for the secure future, all of which are essential to the recovery. So peak is sort of going, walking that spiritual path with you.
Yeah. And so, yeah, those pieces are really essential. And, when I think that again is something that makes peak distinctive.
Yeah.
Not just support group. We're a support. But a support group can be a place you come to, and I'm having a hard time today, and people support you. They encourage you. They affirm you, um, and you walk out of there feeling better. This is a little bit more than that. We're supporting people on a journey with a trajectory. Yes, we want to support people, but we want to support them in rebuilding that identity, in rediscovering their purpose, in all the ways that we talk about in terms of what is the work you're called to do in the world? What are the lessons you're called to learn? Who are you called to love now? And so, yeah, we really are trying to inch one another forward in that process. And it is inch by inch. Spurgeon said, by perseverance, the snail reached the ark. and, and so we are with the snails, making our way steadily in that direction. And yeah, that really goes beyond just encouragement and affirmation to, okay, let's help stir up one another to the energy, keep moving and taking the next step.
One of my favorite quotes is Rumi, we are all just walking each other home.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites by a long shot. So This has been really good, I think, to be able to enumerate and really get these out in the air so that people understand what sets us apart, what are we looking for, what are our goals, how do we help, how do we want to help. So I think that's by listening, helping people understand, giving them the opportunity to come out of isolation, all of those sorts of things by joining a peak group. So thanks for spending the time with me around this, and we'll be walking each other home again.
Okay, Kelly, thanks.
All right, take care.
Bye.